Hey guys, some time ago I did a video talking about whether or not IRC, Internet Relay Chat, was a social network. And today I'd like to do a little bit of a follow-up video, one of my kind of rambly vlogs where I just talk a little bit about IRC, some sort of expanded thoughts on it, and why I think that it not only is a social network, but I think it's one of the best social networks. So IRC, or Internet Relay Chat, was developed and released in 1988, so it predates the World Wide Web by 2 years, which I think is really quite interesting. And any social network, and I'm going to call it a social network just because it's going to be my go-to sort of phrase for it, okay? If you sort of don't necessarily agree with that, then that's fine, but I've got to sort of think about this linguistically as well. So any social network that's been around longer than the World Wide Web definitely deserves some recognition on that basis alone. And it's still quite readily used, obviously not as much in it as it is in its heyday, but it's still readily used by techies and people in the open source community and people in the Linux community, and also as well some people in like the gaming community as well. There are plenty of gaming channels on IRC. In fact, there's almost everything is covered. You know, everything nerdy that you can imagine, there is going to be an IRC channel. There's one for Wikipedia, the Star Wars one. So you know, you've got a lot of bases covered. So there is, and also of course, if there isn't an IRC channel that is talking about something that you want to talk about, you can make it yourself. It's very easy, and it's one of those kind of systems where you can just jump in and get started, and you can work it out as you go along, and there's not really any kind of penalties or problems with doing that. So yeah, basically IRC it's a social network. It's been around a long time, and obviously it's not without its faults. Every social network has its issues here and there, but the fact that it's like open source, federated, and somewhat easy to use, although I'm going to cover that in a second now, it covers a lot of those bases significantly better than the likes of Twitter. So Twitter's going to be my comparison. To me, Twitter is the arch social network in terms of its focus is to be a social network and not really be too much beyond that. Even its instant messaging platform is not that great. IRC, on the other hand, I personally found its latency to be very, very small and very, very good at sort of low latency text communication. You'd think that nowadays that would not be such a difficult thing to get down. I don't know, Twitter seem to have trouble. Whenever I send a message or text message via Twitter, I reckon it probably takes the best part of a minute, 40 seconds maybe, to actually get to its destination. Twitter, obviously, much more centralized and larger than IRC, but if IRC can do it, then there you go. So when I say it's easier to use, it kind of is and it isn't, and it depends how you approach it, and this is very much the open source kind of way of going at it. So for example, if I were to say to a new computer user completely, right, if you want to get onto this IRC social network, you need to download an IRC client, you need to configure it with the correct server, the correct channel, then you need to enter your username, and then you go into the room. Now, if you want to say preserve your username, or if you want to register your username, then you have to do X, Y, and Z as well. That's a very complicated process for someone that isn't comfortable using computers. However, open source will provide. And if I really just wanted to provide an interface by clicking a link, so as you can see down in the description of this video, I've got a link to my IRC channel for this YouTube channel, which is actually sort of doing pretty well, I'm happy to say. What you can do is just click the link, it will go in, it will ask you for your username, you type in any username that currently isn't taken, you don't even have to sign up for it, and bam, you're in the room talking to people straight away. It's a very common and recognizable interface, and I like the fact that it seems to be very pragmatic. Like, there aren't generally ads on it, but if you use an IRC client that is ad supported, then obviously you will. And then there could very well be some servers that are ad supported as well, but those are going to likely be text only ads and so forth. So for the most part, it is ad-free. For the most part, it's a very small, footprint. You're not sending over big files or anything. It's just little text messages. It's also, I like the fact that the screen is fully used. Space seems to be both in just the web apps and also in the desktop apps. It very much seems to be the case that you pick a window, and almost all of that window is filled up with some usable space. Whereas you get something like Twitter that seems to want to column all its blog posts or its status updates into a very small, narrow column, and you've got white space all down the sides. And don't get me wrong, wall of text is intimidating to a lot of people, most people, in fact. But there are ways of managing space that are sort of that is efficient, while at the same time not being overwhelming. And I think IRC is that perfect balance. That's just me. That's just my workflow. But heck, if you want bigger text or lots of blank space on the screen, I'm sure you can find an IRC client or an IRC setup that will provide that. So it's also open source and federated. So if you're not happy with any of the IRC servers out there and their policies, because the benefit of a federated system like email, where you've got lots of companies or lots of servers that work in conjunction as part of a network, allows for a lot more a lot more efficient management, I'm going to say. So, for example, when it comes to things like chat rooms, you're going to need some moderation for the most part, at least if any communities get to a certain size. Otherwise, you can get all kinds of rather horrible abuse happening there, or even opportunists, criminals, or anything like that. And you want to make sure that your chat rooms are safe. So there is going to need to be some degree of moderation. But any degree of moderation is some degree of censorship as well. Now, I don't believe that all censorship is bad. Especially when a group or a community decide to sort of self-moderate themselves, providing obviously they do it transparently and openly and sensibly. So moderating your own server to make sure that it's kept safe, that is to me a perfectly reasonable form of I guess you'd call it censorship. Censorship, of course, is a very charged word, but for all intents and purposes, if you're running an IRC server, you want that server to be safe and you want the people there to be comfortable. So you are going to probably need to moderate it sometimes, or you're at least going to need to have the options there. So a completely decentralized network can actually make that very, very difficult. And you're going to have to, you might have to come up with some very clever workarounds to try and get that to work. And of course, any sort of ne'er-do-wells that want to try and get past you are also going to try dubious things as well. So a federated network seems to be the best way of keeping for communication. I'm sure many of you will disagree, and I'm sure many of you will talk about things like Tox, which seem to have a very good person-to-person messaging system, which is, and Tox is great. I mean, I would be perfectly happy if, like the rest of the world, ditched Skype and used Tox tomorrow. That would be a solid platform for instant messaging, especially sort of private instant messaging or voice over IP or anything like that. But when we're talking about social networks where multiple people will come together who may never have met before, that's a whole different situation, and that's a whole different way of how a social network needs to be managed. And IRC, I think they got it right that early on, and there is a reason why it's lasted as long as it has. There's also a reason why it doesn't seem to get sort of the negative press attention that things like Twitter seems to get as well, because it allows communities to sort of manage themselves, and it also allows plenty of opportunities for if you can't do something here, then we'll try over on this server or this server, and everyone, it seems that like there is a home for almost everyone in IRC on some server in some channel, and it seems to be that inclusive from that point of view. So yeah, IRC, why is it better than Twitter then? Well, I've given you a few reasons now. But the reason why IRC is better than Twitter is because more people communicate with it. More people use it as a social network. How many people on Twitter or any Twitter-esque platform, it could be Facebook or Instagram or whatever, are not actually using it as a social network, but are using it as a platform to espouse political viewpoints, to promote their blog, to promote some affiliate scheme or pyramid scheme that they're in, or just to sort of give a platform to some rather loud and sometimes obnoxious opinions. Probably more often than it's actually used as an actual social network, as a way to either meet friends or to catch up with old ones, as a way to make new friends or catch up with old ones. And it seems that IRC just seems to have that that idea of meeting new people and worked out. It seems to have that contingent where you go into specific channels and rooms that talk about specific subjects, and it just seems to facilitate the natural flow of a conversation rather than here's a room, talk about what you want to talk about. Having channels and ways of organizing lots of people into various sort of discussion groups that IRC tends to do, it just seems to do it in a significantly better way. There are, like, Facebook and Twitter do sort of lean into this some degree with Twitter's group messaging chats and Facebook's groups as well. But again, there seems to be too much of a focus on things like gaining followers and gaining friends on Facebook and gaining a degree of popularity, and this idea that because you're popular, you're therefore more right, or your opinion therefore is worth more. Whereas in IRC, everyone's thrown in, everyone's equal. You know, there are of course moderators, and in any kind of communities, reputations build up, and some people become revered and some people become despised, and some people, you know, almost seem to develop pantomime-esque characters for either their villainy or their virtuousness. But outside of course, the human failing, IRC just seems to facilitate natural human conversation through text better than any other system whatsoever that I've seen. And that's not to say that there aren't incredibly heated and sometimes unnecessary arguments and fights on IRC. Every platform has that. But it just seems that there are more tools to openly and transparently manage that in IRC than there is in something like Twitter. I mean, Twitter, for example, as a company, seem to not really care about the problems that their platform has. They seem to just be happy sitting on the pile of cash that they've got now, and occasionally complaining that they're not getting as many users as they could do, despite being something like the 5th most commonly visited website in the world and one of the most downloaded apps. It was news when Pokemon Go overtook Twitter in the app downloads. So Twitter is that much of a relevant player for being that big, just in that perspective. So, but it's clear that Twitter is like filling this niche that people don't really want Twitter to fill, but only go to Twitter because no one else is better than that. So I think there's a lot to be said for IRC. I think it is the social network where people listen and consider what you have to say more than any other social network. I think there are, you know, that's not to say that all other social networks are rubbish. I've got to find that when it comes to something like Reddit, again, has a pretty negative reputation. But the key with Reddit is you've got to find the parts of Reddit that are good and stay away from the parts of Reddit that are bad. Reddit is actually quite good in the way that it also seems to sort of federate its own discussion forums so that you don't have too much overflow. Again, Reddit certainly has its problems, but the things that it seems to be doing right seem to be the things that it's taken and been inspired by from social networks like IRC. Those are just a few thoughts, though. It's a little bit rambly, and I'm sure many of you guys have a lot to add and possibly even disagree with. So please feel free to down in the comments section below. That's about it from me today. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I've been Chris Ware, and you've been awesome. Take care now.